So, I am here on this European night and Canadian afternoon with Mr. Vince Beiser. How's the pronunciation of that?
That's pretty good. It's more like Beiser, but close
Beiser.
enough.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to cock it up, but nonetheless, Vince is the author of a truly wonderful book. It's called The World in a Grain, and it's the story of how sand has transformed civilization, and it is a exploration of this natural resource which we definitely take for granted and don't give any sort of credence to the true value of it. And it's great because it looks into the geopolitics of this natural resource. It touches upon the illegal mining of this natural resource, the importance of it in our everyday life, how it is, maybe commonly known that it's a main ingredient for sand, but it's also a absolutely crucial ingredient to microchips from the silica exponent of it. So it truly is in everything that we touch. And with that typically too many worded introduction, that I welcome Mr. Vince to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Ryan. It's great to be here.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate you giving me the time. So to get the ball rolling, I was hoping to understand just a little bit about you and what drew you to the topic initially, because you are a journalist after all. But I really romanticize the investigative nature of the book, because you did go, for example, you have great but also harsh experiences in India, in Mongolia, in China, throughout Asia, in America. It's just very fascinating. It's a very deep investigative dive into this natural resource. So what sort of catalyzed for you this lengthy commitment to turn it into a book rather than just an expose or something like this?
Yeah, well, it didn't start out that way, to tell you the truth. I mean, what happened was, I'm a full-time freelancer, so I'm always looking for a good story, so I read a lot of kind of obscure, out-of-the-way publications. I read a lot of international press. And I ran across this story, a few years ago now, about a farmer who had been murdered in India over sand. And I just thought, what, sand? Like, why in the world would anybody kill somebody else over sand? Like, who cares about sand? I'd never given it a moment's thought. I didn't even really know that it was like a commodity that had any value at all, right? Mm-hmm. But, so I started looking into it and come to find out that, in fact, even though most people barely ever think about it, even though it seems like the most trivial thing in the world, sand is actually the most important solid substance on Earth, right? It's we can go into this a bit more later, but in a nutshell, it's the raw material that our cities are made out of. Sand is the main component in concrete, glass, all these other things. So there's a huge demand for it all over the world, especially in the developing world where cities are growing really, really fast. And it's gotten there's so much demand that a black market has arisen, and organized crime gangs have gotten involved, and hundreds of people as a result have been murdered over sand. Not just that one guy. It turns out he was just one of very many. And I just thought this is the craziest thing I'd ever heard. Like, who knew? Who knew we needed sand? Who knew there was a black market for it? Who knew the black market was so intense that people are actually dying for it? Mm-hmm. So I went over Wired magazine, which is a big science and technology magazine here in the U.S., and there's a UK edition as well, and a few others around the world. Anyway, they sent me to India to do a story about that, and as I got deeper and deeper into the reporting, I came to realize, well, there's so much more here, about what's going on, all the environmental damage that goes with it, all the crime that's generated by it, and also the history behind it, all the science and the history behind things like concrete and glass and silicon chips. And one thing led to another, and next thing you knew, I was writing a book about the whole thing.
Has there been an attempt similar to yours done beforehand that you could lean on, or was it all individual articles and press clippings accumulated over a long period of time?
Yeah, nobody's done a book like mine before. So there was a lot that I had to do from scratch. I wasn't the very first person to report on the black market in sand, for sure. It's a big story in the Indian press. India has a really lively journalism scene, and it's a big story there. There's almost every single day. So there's a lot of reporters.
Right. They know about it.
as a kind of ongoing news story. And then there's a couple of folks who've written some really quality, sort of more sciencey books about sand and, the geology and, and touching on things we use it for. Mm-hmm. But nobody'd ever brought it all together like that. So it was I had this very unique opportunity, which is part of why I was so glad I got to write the book.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you did. It was for the people that listen to this podcast, but also myself, there is a very lively interest in sort of natural resources and how it shapes geopolitics. And it's plain as day for anyone to look at how renewables does that, how oil does that, or even how water does that to an extent. But sand, as you, I think, justifiably assert, because I was skeptical when I first heard it, but sand may well and truly be the most important solid substance on Earth. Which is wild. So you did tease it a little bit before then, but could you explain why sand is the most important solid substance on Earth?
Sure. Mainly, like I said, because it's the raw material that our cities are made out of, right? If you look around you right now, and same goes for your listeners, wherever you are, guaranteed the floor beneath you, the ceiling over your head, the walls around you, excellent chance they are made out of concrete. Right, just like every modern building that's built anywhere in the world today, from South Africa to Mongolia, is made with concrete. Every shopping mall, every apartment block, every office tower, made with the same stuff. And what is concrete? Well, it's really mostly just sand and gravel that have been glued together with cement. Mm-hmm. So every building that you're looking at is really thousands of tons of sand that's just been stuck together to form a solid. And it doesn't end there, right? So we have sand that makes up all the buildings. Sand also makes up the roads that connect all those buildings, right? They're also made out of concrete or asphalt, which is similarly just sand that's been glued together. The windows, every single window in every one of those buildings, as well as the windows on your car and the glass in your eyeglasses, is also made of sand. Glass is just melted down sand. Every piece of glass everywhere in the world, sand. Sand makes the silicon chips that power our computers and our cell phones, that make it possible for us to have this conversation right now. The fiber optic cables that carry much of the internet traffic that this conversation is probably going over right now, also made from sand. So in a nutshell, no sand, no modern civilization. And the crazy thing is we are starting to run out.
Yes, that's very well teased, a bit of foreshadowing for what we'll definitely be getting to. But just to raise the stakes a little bit on what you just said, because even if I just take that at face value and say, yeah, there's a lot of concrete around, there's a lot of roads around, there's a lot of glass around, but hey, I've been to the Sahara Desert, I go to the beach, and things look pretty hunky-dory to me, because isn't the entire ocean bed just a giant tonnage of sand? And I think if that was the case, that really we could just pick up any sand from anywhere and turn it into the products that we use, then it might not be so important to worry about. But you document the sort of the gradation of sand. And this is really, really important to take into account, because you can't just take any old sand for concrete, which is the lowest grade, but then imagine once you're getting to a microchip, imagine the type of gradage of sand you need to get. Could you explain the different gradations of sand?
Sure. So, I mean, sort of back up a little bit to where you started from. It's true, of course, there's a lot of sand on the Earth. In fact, it's the most abundant thing on the planet, is quartz sand, which is the sand that we're most concerned about here. There's a whole lot of it out there, but not all of it works for our purposes. So first of all that sand in deserts is basically useless to us. And the reason is the grains of desert sand are shaped differently from the grains of sand that you find at the bottom of rivers or on beaches or on lakes. Desert sand has been eroded by wind over thousands and millions of years, and that's given it a more rounded shape. It's almost like little spheres, whereas sand that's been eroded by water, the stuff that you find, like I say, in lake beds or river beds or in beaches, it's got a more angular shape, more corners and edges to it. So that stuff, that water eroded sand, locks together to form a solid structure, concrete, which is the number one thing that we use sand for by far is concrete. Whereas desert sand, because it's so round, it just doesn't hold together. It's like the difference between trying to build something out of a stack of millions of little marbles as opposed to a stack of millions of little bricks. So all that desert sand, taken off the table. So the other sand, yeah, there is a lot of it. But what you have to understand is we use more of it than any other natural resource on Earth except water. We use 50 billion tons of gravel and sand and gravel every single year, which is enough to cover the entire state of California. All right, so when you're talking about quantities that big, there's a lot of it, but eventually you're going to start to run into limits. So as you said, so the number one thing that we use sand for is concrete. And for that, you can use the sand that makes concrete can be found pretty much in every country in the world. But it is starting to get tapped out in a lot of locations. People are using it up. And basically, most of our other things that we use sand for, the sort of purity level, the amount of the quartz purity of the sand determines what you can use it for. So concrete you can make with, like I say, sand that's found everywhere in the world. Glass, to make glass, you need sand that has a much higher level of purity, that's much more pure quartz. And that you can find in a lot of places, but far fewer. When you get to the sand that we use to make things like solar panels and microchips, that sand needs to be incredibly pure to begin with. And there's only a very few places in the world where that comes from. And in fact, Spruce Pine, North Carolina, which is this little town in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, is the source of the purest quartz sand that's ever been found anywhere on Earth. And that sand is used in the manufacturing of pretty much every single computer chip in the world.
How does the demand for solar and the panels, sort of the promise of the renewable wave, how does this seemingly, not exponentially, but drastically increasing demand for solar panels stack up against the availability of the extremely pure quartz silica sand?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So far, it seems to be okay because the amount, even though there's a smaller supply of that kind of high purity quartz sand, the amounts that we use of it are actually relatively small, right? There's lots of solar panels, but each one of them only uses, a pretty small amount of sand to create it. So far, it's expensive to get that sand, which tells you that it's, there's a certain pressure on supply, but I haven't really run across anybody who thinks that we're really looking at a shortage of that kind of sand. Ironically, the sand that we're really running short of is just the mass bulk
Concrete sand.
Concrete sand, yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any insight into whether this spruce pine is responsible for the huge majority of sand that's being used for the solar panels as well? You made it evidently clear that it's for the silicon chips, but is it for the solar panels as well? So
the sand from spruce pine is used. I mean, they do use it to make things like solar panels, but its most important use is to make something called a quartz crucible. So without going into all the details, to make a computer chip, which is basically pure silicon, a pure silicon wafer, you have to melt down pure silicon at an extremely high heat. And the pot that you melt it in has to do two things. It has to be able to withstand incredibly high heat, and it has to be incredibly pure, made purely of a substance that won't react with that silicon. Because even like a stray molecule or two can ruin your batch of silicon.
Yeah, you put it into perspective and suggest that it's like one particle out of a billion particles would be enough of a contamination. Like that's how pure it needs to be of silicon.
Exactly. So the pot that you're melting that stuff in has to be made of something that won't contaminated, and it turns out that thing is quartz. So the spruce pine sand is actually goes to make those crucibles, those pots that they make the silicon in. It doesn't go so much to make the actual chips themselves, but it's the hardware that they use to melt the silicon down in. It's the only place they can find quartz that's pure enough to make that stuff. And then the silicon that they make the actual chips from can come from other places, but only spruce pine sand is good enough to make the pots to melt that silicon down in.
Okay, that makes sense. I was just thinking of it from a geopolitical perspective. If the United States had the sole control and production over an input that solar could not live without, that would be a lot of power. That would
put the U.S. in a very, very powerful position.
Yeah, power that's not necessarily documented on. You talk about trade wars, or you talk about sanctions. If we were to transition away from oil and be relying on the equator's abundant solar energy, the US could be like, oh, but we're not going to sell you the main ingredient anymore. And that would be quite fascinating. But obviously, there's a lot more at play there. Look, Vince, you said a lot in the gradations, and I, we could linger on the gradations for quite a while, I think, as well, because it's just important to hammer home think about, for me at least, when I was thinking about what you said, is like, okay, so blocks can stack, they're good binding agents, marbles can't stack. Very elegant way to put it. Everyone can understand that. Where does the blocks come from? Well, it comes from underwater, because the water is this bit of cartilage in between that doesn't chip away at the finer edges. And then it's like, but where is the water? I mean, where is that sand coming from then? Well, it's underwater. And then how's the most accessible? It's just going up to a beach and hoovering it up, or going to a lake and hoovering it up. And it doesn't take a environmental expert to hypothesize as to what the sort of damage this can do to an environment. It's, to anyone who's ever surfed, they understand how an entire beach can change just because of a sandbank that rolls in one day. So could you explain to us some of the environmental damage that is coming from this sand mining, both legal and illegal?
Sure, absolutely. So let me step back and just give you a quick primer on where that sand actually originates from in the first place. That'll sort of help you picture it. So basically, sand can be, the word sand can refer to small pieces of anything, any hard substance. So sand can be, flint or chert, it can be crushed up seashells, anything. But most of the sand in the world, and the sand that we human beings use the most by far, is quartz sand, which is a very hard sand. And it's the most, like I said, the most common kind of sand. Estimated about 3/4 of all the world's sand is quartz. So where does that stuff come from? It's basically little tiny pieces of mountains, right? What happens is you've got mountains and, other geologic formations, rock outcroppings and stuff that get eroded, right? The wind and the rain are constantly chipping away at those things and breaking off little pieces, little grains. And then the rains wash those grains down the mountainsides, and then the rains collect into rivers and carry that sand with them all the way out, across the land to where the rivers meet the sea. So the sand gets deposited. Those rivers are like dropping sand all along that course. So sand accumulates in the river bed at the bottom of the river, on the river banks, the sides of the river. Over time, those rivers change course, right? So you'll have sand left behind in what used to be a riverbed but is now dry land. And of course, the places where the rivers meet the sea, which is beaches. That's why you have so much sand on beaches. So we get that sand from all those places. We mine it from on the land, we mine it from the water, we mine it from beaches, we mine it from the oceans and lakes. The easiest way, like you said, to get it, and probably the most common way, is rivers, right? It's really easy to do. You just put a big old barge out in the middle of a river, drop a pipe down to the bottom of the river, just suck up all the sand, pile it onto your barge, and then you can take it wherever you want to go. It's very easy to do. It's quite cheap. Sand is clean, nicely sorted, but it can cause massive environmental damage, right? So First thing is, obviously, if you've just vacuumed up the entire bottom of a river, well, you've just annihilated the habitat of whatever was living down there, right? Any fish or frogs or, plant life, whatever was down there, their habitat is now gone. Secondly, when you do that, you also stir up whatever other mud and, muck and silt was down there, and that clouds up the water, right? All that stuff, flows up into the water and gets suspended in the water. And that can actually suffocate whatever's living in the water, whatever fish are swimming around. Freshwater mammals like porpoises and crocodiles can literally suffocate in that polluted water. Third thing is all those pollutants, all that the muck in the water blocks sunlight from getting through the water down to plants living under the water's surface, which need sunlight just like regular plants do. So that kind of mining, that kind of river and lake mining has caused huge environmental damage all over the world. It's wiped out mangrove beds, coral reefs, seagrass beds, slaughtered huge numbers of fish and reptiles, and even the birds that live on fish. As if you kill off all the fish in a big chunk of river or lake, all the birds are going to starve to death, the birds that used to eat those fish.
Could you give some examples of places where this has happened?
Sure. Well, it's a big issue in many parts of India. I mean, the Yamuna River, for instance, which is the river that goes through New Delhi. It's a big river. It's been heavily mined, and it's really been catastrophic. I mean, in theory, it's illegal to mine sand from there because there's been so much damage, but there's so much corruption in the system that a lot of it's still going on. So there's been huge, die-offs of birds and fish all throughout India. The Yangtze River in China, which is a huge, extremely important river that flows into Shanghai and provides drinking water for something like 400 million people.
Really?
They were mining, so much sand was being mined out of the Yangtze. It was causing riverbanks to collapse and fouling up shipping and, doing other kinds of harm. So eventually the authorities banned that as well, but it also still continues illegally. And in lots of other places. I mean, in some places it gets so bad that it leads to violence. For instance, in Kenya, in this area about an hour outside of the capital Nairobi, there's this agricultural area where sand miners have been digging a lot of sand out of the rivers to go and sell to developers in Nairobi, which is growing really fast. And they've dug out so much sand that the water table has actually dropped, and the local farmers are losing their drinking water and the water for their crops. And they've actually, so the farmers have basically gone to war with the sand miners. A bunch of people were killed in fighting between those two groups a few years ago.
That's crazy. It is a great reminder of the just complexity and balance of an ecosystem, because you could be naive enough to think, well, I could just come in here and suck out a bunch of sand. I mean, it's not going to affect the fish, right? It's certainly not going to affect the birds, right? But maybe it could even go so far as it affects the drinking population for a city. And then the second, third, fourth order effects down from there are, incalculable, essentially.
Absolutely.
Like in
There's
Kenya, it's ending in warfare,
Yeah. There's another way that it can have really terrible impacts, which is coastal erosion. Okay, so what happens is, there are a lot of coastlines all around the world, right? Beaches, river deltas, and so on. They're always eroding, right, in the natural course of things. Tides and winds are always sweeping away some of that land, some of that sand that's along the coast, washing it out to sea. Now, in the normal course of things, usually that erosion is counterbalanced by, among other things, rivers, right? Like I said, rivers are always bringing fresh
always carrying
sand down, right? So there's a kind of rough equilibrium that gets established. But now what's happening in some places is A, we've built a lot of dams on those rivers that block sand from getting through. B, because of sand mining, we're taking so much sand up out of those rivers that they are no longer replenishing the coastline. So natural erosion is continuing, but natural replenishment has stopped. And one of the places where this is really getting to be a serious crisis is in the Mekong River Delta in Vietnam.
Okay.
So the Mekong River is one of the biggest, most important rivers in the world. The delta, where it hits the sea, is this incredibly rich agricultural area. It produces something like half the rice that's consumed in all of Southeast Asia,
Wow.
not just Vietnam. Yeah, it's crazy.
Okay.
That area is disappearing. The Mekong Delta is shrinking at the rate of a football field, like a soccer pitch worth of land is disappearing every day.
Wow.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because the Mekong is no longer, it's eroding, but Mekong is no longer bringing in enough fresh sand to maintain it.
Yeah. I mean, the replacement rate of sand is in the, hundreds of thousands, millions of years?
Well, yeah, it's stone and it moves in geological time. So to create sand
we can't be like, oh well, this is actually sustainable sand mining because I'm only taking a ton a year and 1.1 tons is coming back naturally. It's not like that.
Well, I mean, there is such a thing as sustainable sand mining, and there are a lot of places where it's done more carefully, and if you hit the balance right, you can keep doing it for a long time. I mean, there's sand mining in every country in the world, in places like the UK, Britain, and US and Canada, where we live. It's a lot more closely monitored, and that's why there's definitely environmental problems that come along with sand mining in Western countries, but in general, it's much less of a problem. And one of the reasons is because we have a better system of regulations and enforcement of those regulations.
Oh, it's interesting you say that. I was under the impression that any sand mining was inherently going to come at an unsustainable cost, and it was just the case that in countries like maybe Australia or the United Kingdom, like you mentioned, they've just measured the trade-off as being sustainable in their eyes, right? Whereas in places like in India and Kenya, and I'm sure in Vietnam and many other places that you document in the book, it's being done at a egregiously unsustainable level. But it sounds like if there is such a thing as sustainable sand mining, then there's a possibility that it is we do have the capacity to continue creating roads throughout Africa, giant high rises. Like there's a lot.
Yes and no.
Right?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
It's a really good question, and it's a bit complicated to answer. So one of the reasons that sand mining it causes fewer problems in the developed world is because we're not using nearly as much of it per capita anymore, because we've built our cities, our roads, our dams, our airports. We built them sort of gradually over the last 150 years. We still use a hell of a lot of sand, obviously, right? We're still building new stuff out of concrete all the time, but the amounts that we're using are more or less, plateaued. The big difference is in places like India, China, Indonesia, Brazil, these developing countries where the economies are growing really fast.
Yeah.
They're having to create almost from scratch, cities for millions and millions of people overnight. So, I mean, what's happening there is the same thing that happened in the Western world 100 years ago, right? More and more people are leaving the countryside, leaving the rural life and coming into cities where there's more economic opportunity. But whereas in the West, that happened, you had millions of people moving out of the countryside over the course of decades. Today, in today's world, you have hundreds of millions of people moving out of the countryside over the course of just a few years, right? We're talking right now, something like 90 million people every single year move into cities. In other words, cities are growing we're adding the equivalent of 9 New York cities to the planet every single year. That is not sustainable.
Yeah, true. That's a very good way to put it. While in the West, as you could say, progression was over 100, 150 years. The developing world, which have significantly higher populations, are urbanizing at a 10x rate that we were, and therefore it's simply a case of time versus demand. You know, and
Exactly.
yeah,
And also scale, because I mean, there's over 1 billion people in China alone. The whole population of Western Europe and the U.S. and Canada together is less than that.
yeah, yeah,
So
unbelievable.
it's never been the case that this many people that have been, using the products that we make sand for, right? We've had this many people living in apartments and driving cars and working in offices. That's a brand new thing just of the last 20 years or so.
This takes me a bit off the course that I was trying to chart, but you mentioned China, and while they do have 1.6 billion people, like you said, pretty much more than all the big Western economies in the world combined, what is it? 2/3 of their population lives on the eastern 1/3 of the land, and then 1/3 live in the rest. And therefore, and they've built these ghost cities, not intentionally, of course, but they built giant cities which no one's living in. So it's such an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? In a world that has a unbelievably huge population who is urbanizing at a rate unforeseen in history, they can still manage to have empty skyscrapers and roads, and it's unbelievable. Could you talk a bit about more of the one that you documented in, I think it's on the border of Mongolia?
Yeah. New Ordos. Yeah, so like you said, China is urbanizing at a rate way beyond anything that's ever happened before in human history. It's more than something like 60% of all Chinese now live in cities, which is, and just a generation or two ago, the number was maybe half that.
Sure.
And most of those cities are close along the coast or close to the coast, right? That's where all the money is. That's where everybody's going. So the Chinese government knows that's a problem, right? You just can't have that many people in that small a space. So they're building these cities, further inland, trying to attract people, trying to get people to stay in the rest of the country, but it's just not really working out, right? Because like the one that I went to, New Ordos, is this city. They just decided basically like, we're going to put a city for 1 million people right here in the middle of the sort of Mongolian drylands, right? It's like right on the edge of the Gobi Desert. There's not much around there for a long, long way. But they just built almost from scratch this big, beautiful city with modern highways and shopping malls and a gigantic open plaza and huge, beautiful public library. Yeah, and I went there a couple of years ago, and there was almost nobody in the whole city. It's really eerie. It's like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. You're walking these streets, and like way down there, you'll see one other person, and way over there, one car's driving along.
What was that like? Did you try getting into buildings? It strikes me as a place that would become an outpost for a lot of crime, but maybe that's not the case.
Well, I don't think so. It certainly didn't feel dangerous. It just felt almost deserted.
Yeah.
There's stores. I went into some stores. I went into a shopping mall and walked around. There's a few people in there, and
that's
I went to have a
case,
beautiful,
having a store in an empty
beautiful
city.
library. Like really, a lot of very architecturally interesting buildings. They've got a cultural center that's sort of in the shape of an onion, and this beautiful like 5-story library. And I went on into the library. You walk up this sort of grand set of 100-odd steps to get to the door, and then at the door there's a metal detector that you're supposed to walk through. And I walked right through it. I set it off because I had my camera and my recording gear on. Alarm started beeping away. There was no guards, nobody around, nobody did anything, nobody came out. So I just walked in and wandered around for a while. There's, maybe somebody reading a book over there and a librarian way down there. You know, Nobody
What a
bothered
cool
me.
experience. I really want to do that. What year was this when you did that?
Geez, must have been 2016, maybe 2017, probably 2016.
Okay. Let's bring it back to sand because you are teasing the geopolitics there, which I do have specific questions about. But just to bring it back to sand, to try and hit people in the head again with just the enormous quantities of it. From the book, there is a part where you mention an estimation for how much sand is in the world. 7.5 billion grains, which is a big stupid number that's totally incomprehensible for us to make any sort of sense of. But could you pass that, if possible, into a sort of pie chart? If 7.5 billion is all the sand available, what percentage of it is concrete grade, what percentage of it is glass grade, and then what percentage of it is silica grade? I know no one knows, but to your best of your knowledge.
Sure. So indeed, nobody knows for sure. So take everything I'm about to say with a big old grain of salt. So in that 7.5, I forget, it's like quintillion. I don't even remember all the illions in it, but that's actually this one researcher's estimate just for the number of grains of sand on beaches.
Oh, was
beaches.
it? Okay. Wow. So
it's even more than
X.
that.
Yeah.
But yeah. Well, so the overwhelming bulk of it is lower grade, stuff that you could use for concrete. I'll tell you the amounts that are extracted, the amounts that we use. We use in the United States, for example, and I think these ratios are probably pretty typical. We use 10 times more sand for concrete every year than for everything else put together.
Sure.
Everything else put together is mostly glass. That's the number two thing. And fracking, actually, which is another thing we use sand
that
for
was
in the US
interesting.
we didn't get into. So glass is probably, 5-10% of global consumption. The really high purity stuff that we use for high tech applications, computer chips, silicon panels, stuff like that, or solar panels, stuff like that is probably 1%, 2%. Maybe.
Okay. Well, that's good. It kind of, reminds really what the crazy volumes of this sort of sand is. The Spruce Pine, you went there and they were extremely secretive about pretty much the entire operation. They were even at one point touch aggressive to you when you were just trying to sort of hang out in front of the building. So they're famously secretive, and also this company are essentially the ones that are producing the silica grade sand for the microchips that goes to the semi-conductors that goes to, the stuff that runs the world. Do you suspect that they're hiding their figures of how much they're pulling out of the ground and maybe having reserves to sort of dictate the price, like how maybe the diamond industry has famously done it in the past? Do you have any speculation as to why they are so secretive about their organization?
That's a good question. They're very. They know that they've got an incredibly valuable resource, and they don't want to. They don't want to do anything that might tip off their competitors, mainly about where they're. How much sand they've got, what they're doing to get it, like their specific methods for extracting it and for processing it and purifying it. There's a lot that goes into it. Once you dig the stuff out of the ground, you still have to. You got to clean it. You want to purify it. There's a number of steps you want to do to it, and those are all trade secrets. It's proprietary stuff. So I think that's the main reason. I should say, in general, mining companies, any kind of my experience with producers of raw materials is they're just very secretive. They don't like to talk about what they're doing. They know that nobody likes them. right? They know that, they're a big target for environmentalists, and everybody knows. Like, a mine is just an ugly thing. Whatever kind of mine it is, there's no getting around that. You're just digging a big, huge hole in the earth, and it's not pretty, and it causes a lot of mess, and they know that, so they're not in a hurry to make it easier for people to point fingers at them.
Sure. You mentioned fracking. Maybe we do you want to? Is that something you really want to speak about, or because I'm just conscious of the time, and I did want to get into some of the geopolitical questions.
Up to you, man. It's your show. You ask me what you're interested in.
Yeah, but
There's
it's also
a million
cool.
Tangents I could go on. Whatever you want to hear.
It's cool. It's cool to see you lean on things that are most closest to your heart. Is there anything about sand that is for you like the thing? Like, if you have to elevator pitch someone what matters with sand, what's closest to your heart there?
Well, I'll tell you, the thing that, to me, what gets me the most about the whole sand issue isn't sand itself. It's the way that sand points up something bigger, which is this, right? Sand is the most abundant thing on the planet, right? And now come to find out we are running low on that, right? Well, it sounds very familiar, right? Because we all know it's a familiar story, right? We know we're cutting down too many trees. We know we're taking too many fish out of the oceans. We know we're using up too much fresh water. We're using up too much sand, right? These are not separate problems. They're all symptoms of the same problem, which to my mind is just that we are over-consuming. Human beings, and I mean mostly us human beings in the rich world, we're just consuming natural resources at a rate that cannot be sustained, and it cannot be scaled up to the 7 billion people that already live in the world, let alone the 9 billion people that we will have soon. The fact that we're running out of something as basic as sand, to me, that just really underscores and illustrates how we have absolutely got to find ways to live our lives and to build our cities, which is where most people now live, in ways that just consume less. Not only less sand, but less of everything, less energy, less wood, less raw materials. We've got to, that's the great issue of our time.
How do you... No, finish your thought.
Well, sand is just a particularly striking example of that because it's so counterintuitive, right? How in the world...
It is counterintuitive, definitely, yeah.
Right? But the fact that we're running out of something as simple and ubiquitous as that, that should really tell us something.
Yeah, it should. And hopefully we are hammering home, or at least creating a good argument for the assertion you make at the very beginning that it is the most important solid substance on the earth. If we're using enough to cover the state of California every year, we can only really copy and paste California X amount of times on the globe before you're like, holy hell, we might not have enough of this stuff. And
Exactly.
It is super important. And now I bring that up. There's so many areas we can take it. Could you give just a quick response? And I know you dedicate an entire chapter to this in the book, but you document the history of concrete essentially and the highway building in America and so forth. Could you just give a few sentences to maybe what the world might look like if we didn't have concrete? Just to maybe somehow hammer at home the importance of this substance. Is it responsible for our civilization, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's no exaggeration to say that, modern civilization as we know it could not exist without concrete. We just couldn't build on the scale that we have without it. And it's amazing to think, we've really only been using modern concrete for a little over 100 years. But if you think about the world before then, the world around 1900, okay, the tallest building on the planet was about 10 stories high, right? On Earth.
I'm in a bigger building now.
Yeah, well, what did we use for building? We used wood, we used brick, we used stone. These are good solid building materials, but you can't build a 50-story skyscraper out of bricks, right? Or wood. You certainly can't build a dam, a giant dam big enough to hold back the Nile or the Yangtze or the Colorado River out of stone, right? The way that, dams used to be made. You probably couldn't even have the automobile, right? Before the car came along, there were very few paved roads anywhere in the world,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Most transport went by water, right? We moved goods around on boats and horses, and roads were like, dirt tracks, or you might get out, people would pave them with stones, which is takes a lot of time. It's a very expensive way to go, and you don't get that great of a quality of road. What made road building possible, which is the thing that made cars possible, is concrete. It's really cheap. It's really easy to use. You can deploy millions of tons at it very quickly, and it's a great product. You end up with a smooth road that'll hold up that car, that'll hold up that truck. So, without concrete, we don't have modern roads. I don't see what else you could build modern roads capable of bearing that much weight and going that distance. I don't know what else you could build roads out of. I don't know what else you could build, hydroelectric dams that are a huge source of the world's electricity. I mean, something like a quarter of all America's electricity comes from hydroelectric dams, and certainly the first dams were that.
Hydro doesn't get the credit it deserves. In Sweden, 60% of that electricity from it.
Is that right?
Yep.
So yeah, and you couldn't do that with concrete. How could you possibly build a dam like that out of bricks? You couldn't.
Yeah.
You couldn't build modern cities, right? So without concrete, I can't see how we would have cities on the scale that we have them. I can't see how we would have, trade, everything that the automobile has brought, transport and trade and everything else. I mean, electricity would be far, far harder to wrangle. Human beings are ingenious. We would have come up with something, but I just, the world would look radically different. And I think it would be a much smaller and less developed and more, a much more agrarian world, probably.
Yeah, that's a great caveat to make at the end there. It's not as if it's one or the other. The world would look differently. We certainly would have progressed, and we certainly would have made a lot of, well, you cannot say certainly, most likely would have made some, excellent headway. But when you really go back to the fundamental building blocks, like the first principles, that's maybe overused these days, but of society, it's kind of like roads is so fundamental to that. And it's funny, this only just came to me now, but something often that I hear about when Africa is being spoken of is, well, just they need the infrastructure and then they can flourish. And what's the infrastructure? It's roads. It's an airport. It's on the border of Ethiopia and Sudan right now. They're building the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. One of the most unnecessary third words in a title ever, but it's this amazing dam, huge, enormous, 6.5 gigawatts or something. I'm not quite sure what that means, but you compare it to what maybe a coal plant could output, and it's a lot more.
Right.
And, it's just like concrete enables this, because concrete is, as you document in that chapter, it's just exponentially stronger than the next best thing you could find. And also, most importantly, cost efficient as well. But I think that does tee up quite well. Actually, before we go on, let's do the fracking very quickly, because obviously this was an amazing innovation that happened. I'm not sure how long ago in the US, but it was relatively recent, right?
Yeah, well, it's really, they started, the idea sort of dates from the 70s or so. They started it back in the 70s, but it's only in the last, like in the 2010s, where they really, a few different technologies came together to make it really work on a big scale. So fracking basically is where you have a lot of oil or natural gas that's trapped in rock formations, right? The oil and gas molecules can't move because they're literally imprisoned in the rock. Yep. So you frack that rock, you fracture it, shatter it, shoot cracks all through it so that the oil and gas can flow through and you can into your well. So the way you do that is you drill a well, you drill a hole down into that rock, and then you shoot that well full of a mixture of water and highly compressed chemicals and sand, right? So the water and the chemicals kind of shatter the rock, just like whacking on on a window, spider webs it all with cracks. And then the sand keeps those cracks open, because the pressure on them, those cracks want to close up again. So you need to shoot millions of tons of sand up into those cracks to keep them open, so the oil will keep flowing through. And turns out for that, you need a very particular kind of sand. You need kind of like glass grade sand, to simplify it. But basically, it's got to be a particular shape and especially hard, very pure fracking sand. So the United States is now using millions of tons of high-grade sand for fracking. And the result of that is that there's only a few places where you find that sand. So the fracking boom, which is mostly in North Dakota and Texas, has also created a frack sand mining boom in other states that are miles away from the oil fields. But places like Wisconsin that have a lot of that kind of sand, there's been a huge surge in sand mining to get at that particular kind of sand, which they then haul off to Texas or to North Dakota to use in fracking.
It reminds me, no, it doesn't remind me. It makes me think of, have you heard of the geothermal, promise of renewable energy?
I mean, I know that, you can theoretically use geothermal energy to provide energy. And I think they actually do it in a few places.
Yeah, I was just hearing the other day, and it reminds me exactly of fracking. But the idea is that you just have to drill down a little bit further and then pump water into it, and assumably sand as well, because it's the cracking of the rock that almost releases the energy, and you need to have the sand in there. But ultimately, the idea is that you dig into the earth 10 to 15, 20 kilometers. Apparently there's a giant piece of quartz in Mexico, which theoretically could have all the energy for the world. But you dig into it and crack into the rock, you shoot in the sand, you shoot in water, and that, because it's, Earth's like a nuclear reactor, so it's hot there, and it's going to remain hot no matter how much we tap it. That just heat of the rock with the water going into it creates the steam, turns the turbine, gets the electricity going. But it's a follow-on. It's like, who knows? Maybe in the geothermal, if this was the way we went, sand, again, there it is. It's this absolutely cannot live without component. And we're running out of it. The biggest geopolitical, because throughout the book, the theme of geopolitics it comes up again and again and again. And you really could look to any part of the world and see how it's influencing. We haven't mentioned your experience in India, which is a very personal one for you, and quite a tragic one as well. But what about in the South China Sea? I thought your paragraph or two on the South China Sea was really, really insightful. So if you could explain a little bit of the geopolitics of sand in the South China Sea, I would really, really appreciate that.
Sure. No, that's a really important issue. So in a nutshell, what's happening is in the South China Sea is this very important strategic region. It sits like at this very important maritime crossroads. Something like half of all the world's shipping passes through there, right? It's this area that's sort of near off the coast of China, Vietnam, Philippines. It's the sort of area right in between all these countries. And they've all been sparring of it, right? All these half a dozen countries have been, saying, oh, it's mine for decades. And it's very important to the rest of the world that it actually just stay open. So there are a few tiny little islands, really like coral reefs, basically, poking up in this ocean, and all the countries have been squabbling over them for years. Well, about 5 years ago, China has been building up its dredging fleet. Right, it has hundreds of ships, probably by now more than any other country in the world, for dredging up sand from the bottom of the ocean. And they sent this dredging fleet to work, just sent them out there to build giant artificial islands on top of these coral reefs. They just pulled up millions and millions of tons of sand from the bottom of the ocean, dumped it right on top of these coral reefs, built artificial islands, built landing strips and military barracks on these islands, and occupied them. So in effect, China went and just created themselves these military bases smack in the middle of this heavily disputed waterway, which, first of all, was a massive environmental blow. They just annihilated huge swaths of coral reef, and also it's a real flashpoint because the United States is committed publicly, and has said many times, we are committed to maintaining freedom of navigation, right? We don't want any country to be able to block shipping through this waterway. And China is in effect saying, you know what, if push comes to shove, we'll decide who gets to go through this waterway. So there's been this kind of, the last few years, we've had this kind of a game of chicken between them, where the U.S. will send Navy ships through there every now and then just to sort of prove a point. And China will send Navy ships out towards them to kind of harass them. And a year or two ago, they almost collided. There was almost like an at-sea, like major collision between two of these ships. Luckily, it didn't happen, but that kind of thing could happen at any time. And basically, it's this real standoff, which could escalate at any time.
And how much do you suspect that the role of sand specifically is going to play in the future of the South China Sea? Do you think more of the same is going to happening? More extraction to build artificial islands to, claim sovereignty to then build whatever fleet of ships you might have there and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're still doing it. They're still adding to that little group of islands. And there's another similar group of islands in the north of the China Sea that they're also building up. And that's probably the most extreme example of how countries are using sand to literally expand their nations. There's all kinds of...
That's a really cool part, yeah.
Yeah, land reclamation, which basically means building artificial land where there was none before, which is usually just sand. You send out barges, you pile up enormous amounts of sand right on your coast, and all of a sudden, boom, you've got extra real estate. So far, mostly, with the exception of the South China Sea, that's mostly just been, to create more real estate that's, you can sell as beachfronts and you can develop it and so on. But inevitably, sooner or later, somebody's going to encroach on their neighbors on a neighboring country's land. And this has already come close to happening with Singapore was building up more and more land and starting to muscle in on what Malaysia considered their territory. So I do expect we'll see more of that kind of thing.
And another point to re-emphasize there is the damage to the ecosystem of the South China Sea, because similarly as the rivers we mentioned earlier, I mean, the physical reshaping of this area, which is one of the most fertile fish areas as well, which millions of people that live on the coasts of, like you said, Vietnam, even Taiwan, even the Philippines would rely on these fishing populations for their living, are having that ecosystem essentially decimated, more or less. So many more instances of sand influencing geopolitics, but I just thought that one was a particularly interesting one since, as you said, it could almost be the flashpoint of whatever the giant sort of Thucydides trap complex is going to be between China and the US eventually. Vince, very generous with your time. 2 rapid ones for you. These are like baselines that I try to ask everyone. What country are you most bullish on looking into the future?
Canada.
Okay.
I just moved here, and I'll tell you, I mean, Canada has something like a quarter of all the world's drinking water.
Wow.
It's a beautiful country. It's got a very small population. And as climate change gets into gear, I think a lot of the parts of Canada that are, too cold to live in are going to get much more temperate. And yeah, I think climate change is going to be a net good for Canada.
Yeah, you're the second person who said that.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Nice. And I totally agree with you. It has to be on anyone's shortlist, I think. And finally, Vince, if you could witness a conversation between any 2 people of history, dead or alive, who would they be?
Wow. What a great question. Huh. Any two people, dead or alive?
Yeah, just narrowed it down for you.
Yeah, right. Uh, Jeez. Sort of overwhelmed by the possibilities. Let me say, let's say Tom Waits, perhaps my favorite singer-songwriter of all
Okay.
time, and Shakespeare,
Okay,
poetry,
nice.
playwright,
It'd be a very melancholic conversation, I'm sure, but it
no
would be
doubt,
interesting.
no doubt.
Vince, pleasure, mate. Thank you so much for your time. And
Likewise.
yeah, I
Thanks for
encourage,
having me on.
thank you, sir. And I encourage anyone who is interested in natural resources, sand, if you happen to be interested in sand, you've probably already read it. But if natural resources is something that you're into, then there is so much that you can learn from your brilliant book, sir. It does document like the history of cement, which is quite good, and so much. We've already just spoken about it for so long, so the people know, I hope.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Cheers,
Appreciate
big fella.
it.
Thanks.